Welcome to the Rivers from the Altar podcast. I'm Robin Nagelvort.
And I'm Amy Johnson. We're here to talk about finding sufficiency in Jesus for the needs of your heart and the purposes He has for your life.
We're so glad you joined us today. Let's get started. Welcome to another episode, and today is going to be a really sweet treat because we get to hear the story of Amy Johnson and her husband and how they came to get to know each other and get married. And so today's a really sweet episode, and we're looking forward to hearing that story. I've listened to it a couple times and heard it a few times, so I'm really looking forward to hearing it again myself and sharing it with all of you. So without further ado, Amy.
Thank you, Robin. Yes, back when I had the episode where I shared my testimony back in those first few introductory episodes that we had, I mentioned that at some point I would tell more of this story. So this is the time to do that. Let me tell you a few things before I get started. Number one, we're doing this as the beginning of a 4-part series about marriage, which is why we thought that this story would fit in right here. I want to tell you that I'm telling you my story because your story matters. When we tell each other stories of what God has done in our lives, it encourages us to remember who He is, to believe Him. It just encourages faith. So here as we launch out, I'm talking about marriage, telling you my story for that reason. And wherever you are in your journey of life, whether you're someone who isn't married yet and hoping to be, or whether you're in the middle of a marriage, whether you're widowed or single mother, all those things, telling a story of God's goodness and faithfulness is always a good thing to do. And it reminds us to trust Him and to put our lives in His hands. I also want to remind you that God is a God of the bigger picture. God is a storyteller, and He puts stories together, but our stories are just a small piece of the big story of the history of mankind that God is weaving together all the time. I've even thought of this in my own life, that God is the God of the bigger picture, because the day that I married Dan Johnson, God already saw the day that I was going to follow his casket out of the church and to the cemetery. He knew. Of course, on the day I got married, I'm so glad he didn't tell me when that was going to happen or how. But in the moment when it did, I knew this. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He's writing my story continuously, and yours too. So we tell stories to glorify God and encourage faith. So I guess I'll get started. I told you more of my testimony in that earlier episode about how I came to Christ and how at age 18, the Lord put it in my heart to surrender to Him my desire for human love, because I had always wanted to be a wife and mother. But I also wanted to make sure that my life was in the hands of Jesus Christ. And I would remind everyone who's listening that a life that has a beautiful story for the glory of God is a life that has been laid down at the feet of Jesus Christ. He came to lay down His life for us, to redeem us from our sin, our self-centeredness, and the beauty of life doesn't even begin until you know the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. So let me remind you, before I even tell you this story, that Jesus Christ is the answer to your deepest need, which is to be saved and delivered from sin and self. He has provided beautiful redemption because of the cross and because of His resurrection, and He's exalted at the right hand of the Father right now, interceding for us, calling people to Himself. So a story like my story is only possible when you have come to Jesus Christ and put your life in His hands. So I did that when I was young, put my life in His hands, surrendered into His hands my desire for human love. And, when I came to Bible school at the Evangelical Institute, of course, I looked around and wondered, is anybody here going to be my husband? And, you look around and there were some nice guys there, but they weren't a fit. And I didn't know what God was going to do. So I walked on and just learned to know Jesus Christ better, to seek Him, to open His Word and learn to fellowship with Him. It was a beautiful time. I had no idea that Mr. Johnson was interested in me at all. But his part of this story goes back quite a ways, actually. I had met him the first time when I was 14 years old and came to a summer conference. But at that time, I had Coke bottle thick glasses and braces, and I dressed more like a kid. And so he actually described me in a chapter that he wrote on a book that he was going to write about guidance and finding who you're going to marry. He described me as a quiet kid, nice, quiet kid. So that was me that first time. But fast forward to when I was 16, I came to a summer conference again. And as he told me this story much later, there was a night in that conference when the meeting was over and people were milling around outside and talking. And my father stood outside and had a conversation with Dan after the meeting. And I was just standing by my father's side and listening. And Dan looked at me. And I think only God could have put this thought in his mind. I don't know how else it could have been there. But he thought, that's the most beautiful girl I've ever seen. Only God could have done that. But I think God was planting the seed thought in his mind at that point. I had no clue. Because at this point, I was 16. He was, 31 or something like that? We're 17 and a half years apart. So he went back to his office and room that night and just thought, oh, Dan, you're just crazy. But he remembered me. And when I was 18 and coming to the Institute for school, he began to pray more that the Lord would guard his heart. Because here's the thing. He was the bachelor teacher living on campus for years. Lots of really nice, sweet Christian girls came and went through that school. Lots of mothers of those girls wanted their daughters to marry Dan Johnson, and he had to be careful of the kind of communication he would make and just the things he would say, because he wanted to guard himself and make sure that whatever happened in his life was the will of God, because I believe God has a very specific plan and will for our lives when we put them in his hands. So I came to school having no knowledge that he was already praying about me. And as we do at the beginning of a process like that, just saying, Lord, your will be done. He wasn't necessarily asking God to give me to him at that point, but praying, Lord, your will be done. I went through those 2 years and I very greatly respected and admired and appreciated Mr. Johnson. I loved the Christ-centeredness of his classes. I felt that kind of admiration for him without having any clue that I would end up falling in love with him. I loved him in that sense of honoring him, but I didn't know all that he was going through in his own mind and heart. When I was coming into my second year, that summer, he spent 3 days praying and fasting because he knew that the following year he was going to have me in more classes and he was going to see me more, and he wanted to know what God was doing and saying. And he didn't get any answer from the Lord, which he said is very unusual. And you spend 3 days praying and fasting over something, you're probably going to get something from the Lord. And it was like the Lord was just quiet. Well, we know now it's because it wasn't the right time for him to say anything, but Dan just went mystified into the second year and trusted God to keep his heart. Several different things happened during that second year that if I had been noticing, I might have picked up on something. Girls typically have their antenna out for noticing if someone is caring about them or paying them special attention or noticing them. I just didn't, because he was a different category. I just didn't think that someone in that category of staff would be interested in me romantically. The other piece of that is that the first day I ever arrived on campus, my first year, a girl who had graduated, bounced up to me on the pathway. I think I told this story before, but she was telling me all the things I was going to love about the Institute. And then she said, oh, by the way, you'll have to get over falling in love with Mr. Johnson. All the girls have to get over that. And I thought, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I'm not here for that. And I'm not going to do that. I dismissed that immediately. But my second year, I remember there was a day that I walked down part of the stairway of my dorm, and there was a little landing where you could look out over the grounds and the trees, and it was a quiet Sunday morning, and I was just looking out and enjoying the scenery, and all of a sudden I looked across the lawn of the campus, because across the way was the dorm where Dan stayed, and he was standing outside the balcony of his room looking at me. And at the time I thought, Oh, phooey. I thought I was alone. And somebody's outside too. That didn't think much about it. Um, and I know at one point that year in school, we had a snow. Here in Greenville, we had 12 inches of snow both years that I was a student in the winter. And so classes were canceled one day, and my roommate and I were walking around, and there were some guys having a big snowball fight. And we happened to walk by, and somebody, I don't know who it was, threw a snowball that hit me so hard between the eyes. And I don't think I've ever had so much pain because of a snowball in my life. Like I couldn't open my eyes. I felt like my eyes were spinning inside my head. And all of a sudden, I felt this hand brushing snow from my face so sweetly, gently, and tenderly. And I thought, who in the world is that? Because I couldn't open my eyes. I was in too much pain. And when I opened my eyes, it was Mr. Johnson. And I remember just being kind of stunned and mystified. I'm like, wow. And I went back to my room and was trying to describe this to my roommate. I was like, this is such a cool place to be. It's just like a family here. I mean, Mr. Carroll's like a father, and, Mr. Johnson is kind of like an uncle or something. And my roommate told me at that moment, she thought to herself, yeah, uncle, right? Like she noticed that there was something there. I just didn't. And that was the Lord's protection of me. So, but went through that second year. And as I graduated and I knew I was coming back for a third year, because you graduate after 2, there's an optional third year. I knew I was coming. After the graduation ceremony, Dan Johnson shook my hand. Now, that seems like a small thing, but he didn't shake girls' hands. He just was so careful about stuff like that. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I didn't think much more about it. The summer in between my second and third year is when the Lord brought to pass this story that was really amazing. And, only God can do it, something like this. And I know that Dan had put his life and his heart and his desires in God's hands. And when the time came, God did amazing things. So normally at the Institute, they have summer conferences that at that time were 2 different week-long conferences in July. They're very intense, a lot of teaching, a lot of responsibility. And for whatever reason, Mr. Carroll, the head of the school, felt led that summer to cancel the conferences, not have them at all, so that the staff could be free to rest and to travel if they wanted to. That was the one and only time he ever did that, but that was the summer of 1988. So Dan was free to travel. And he had people in the New England states and also in Canada that he wanted to visit. Now, I'm from the state of Maryland, which, if you know your geography, if you're traveling from South Carolina to go up to the New England states, you kind of have to go through that area to get up there. And my house was known to be a house of hospitality. My mother was just a very hospitable person. She's been with the Lord a long time now, but she just loved to open our home. And my dad also, godly man, loved to open our home to people. We had a big house, and it was not uncommon for us to have multiple house guests at a time. And it was also not uncommon for people from the Institute to stay in my home, because not only did we have a hospitable home and a beautiful place to rest, but my father was a doctor and he had connections at Johns Hopkins Hospital. So if people had a medical need, often Mr. Carroll would send them up to our house too, to stay for a while and get help, whatever they needed. So it was not unusual that Mr. Johnson would stop by at my house on his way up to New England and Canada, and then on his way back down. That just, there was nothing suspicious about that. It was normal. I was working at the time at a day camp across the road from our home. And so I was gone during the days. I would be home at night. And I knew that Mr. Johnson was coming. And I was very excited about that. In fact, I remember taking note of how excited I was about him coming. I thought, it was one of those moments that I didn't consciously analyze. If I had, I would have thought, wow, I must really like this man. But I didn't think about it. I just knew I was looking forward to it. The girl that had been my roommate at school, Tiffany, sweet friend, she was living with me for the summer and also working at the camp. So we were doing our thing, and Dan came through. And a lot of this backstory then from his side of things, I didn't find out until later. But while he had a couple days there, there was a time when he found himself alone with my mother in the kitchen after a meal. And my mom turned to Dan and said, what do you think the Lord has for Amy after she's done with her 3rd year? She has no idea what she's going to do next after that. And he thought to himself he might stick his neck out just a little bit. He did say to her first, she could do whatever she wants. She could be a doctor like her dad. And my mom said, no, she doesn't want to be a doctor. She's always just wanted to be a wife and mother. And he said, now he had never said anything about his interest in me to anyone in the world, not his mother, not Art Nurnberg, his prayer partner, nobody. But he did say to my mom, he said, well, I've thought about Amy in that way. Of course, I realize, with the age difference, that probably seems unlikely or impossible. Well, my mom was a very quick thinker. And the minute Dan said that, she knew immediately that that was exactly what was meant to happen. But at the same time, she thought, there's so many mothers who have tried to push their young daughters on Dan Johnson. I don't want to be a pushy mother. So she kind of straightened up in her chair and she said, well, it's just a matter of what's the will of God for Amy. And that ended the conversation. Now, in her mind, she was being non-pushy. In his mind, that meant, no way, Buster, never bring this up again. And so he took it as a complete discouragement. And that was a test from the Lord for him. So he, finished out his day or two at our house and he went on his way up north. I had not a clue. Didn't know anything about that conversation, but he went up and he visited people and he spent a few days in Maine, in some of the national parks up there. And at one point he was just discouraged and disheartened. He was by himself. He was out in the lovely scenes of nature that are there. I think Baxter State Park. And he had been growing in his love for me for years and praying about me and just couldn't get it off his mind. And now he felt like he had received this, slap down discouragement. So he was just sort of disconsolate and he was praying and trying to trust the Lord and trying to say, Lord, your will be done. But he was also like, what are you doing, Lord? Why have you allowed me to think about her for these years? And then now this. And, you heard nothing from the Lord. It was just quietly looking around. He's like, Lord, I don't know. Would you just let me see some animals? And so what happened then was over the next half an hour or so, he said he saw every animal you could possibly see in that state park. I mean, you expect to see squirrels, you expect to maybe see chipmunks, maybe a rabbit, but he said he saw, it was like God paraded in front of him every animal you could see in that state park, even to the point where at one point he was driving along a narrow dirt lane in the state park and a moose walked up next to his Toyota, and the moose was taller than his Toyota. And when that sort of thing began to happen, it was almost like the Lord said to him, you see what I did for you when you asked me for animals? Now ask me for Amy. And he realized he never had. He had always said, Lord, your will be done. What do you want? He was bringing himself to the Lord, but he never came right out and boldly asked for me. And so in spite of the discouragement that he thought he had received from my mother, he took that from the Lord and he asked the Lord for me, that I would be his wife. And so he went on and, did the visiting he was going to do in Canada. He came back down. He stayed at my house a couple more days and nothing much of import happened. I will say there was one, because he stayed several days and we had a gathering, like a picnic with some friends at one point over at the camp where I had been working. And I thought, well, I'll show him around a little bit. I'll walk you up the hill to see where we do the arts and crafts barn and stuff. So we ended up taking this walk up the hill to look at the arts and crafts barn. And when we got inside of it and I was showing him the things that we had been doing, all of a sudden the atmosphere was really electric. It was almost like, it wasn't uncomfortable, but it was like, it just seemed like there was some sort of energy between us and I was a little confused by it. I wasn't expecting it. And he told me later, he almost said something at that moment, but he didn't. He restrained himself. And so, we walked back down the hill, finished out the crab feast that we were having, and that was it. And he went back to South Carolina. But here's something that I think is important to the story. He had been scheduled to come back to Maryland a few weeks later in August and speak at like a mini weekend conference at my home church. He had been invited to do that. But when he got back to South Carolina, he said to the Lord, he's like, Lord, I want to make sure that whatever happens with me and Amy is your will and your plan and not my own. So I'm going to cancel going to that conference. And if you want me back up there, you have to send me up there. The interesting thing about that piece of the story is that I think a lot of us, if we really desired something, we would say, the invitation to come back and speak, that's an open door from the Lord to go back and be near her, right? And there wouldn't be anything wrong with seeing it that way, but he was so determined to make sure that whatever happened was the will of God that he canceled the conference and said, Lord, if you want me there, you have to send me there. Well, 2 weeks before school was supposed to begin in September, suddenly it became apparent that there was a need in the family of an evangelist in Nepal. Okay, Nepal is the country above India, way across the ocean. But Dan had been multiple times to Nepal. He had been ministering there, and he knew Resham. Resham was the man who was one of the foremost evangelists in that country. Resham had a young son who had a medical need, and nobody could figure out what to do to help him. So Mr. Carroll said, you know what? The Institute will pay for Resham and his son to come across the sea to America. We will have them stay at the Tecklenburg's house. That's my house. And Dr. Tecklenburg can arrange for medical appointments so that Resham and his son can get some help. And by the way, Dan Johnson, you are the only person in the United States that Resham knows personally. You've got to go up there and stay.
Oh my goodness.
So now, 2 weeks before school is supposed to begin, Mr. Carroll is sending Dan Johnson back to my house. Interesting, huh? And I think that also many of us, if we really desire something and we are asking God to show us, we might take every little encouragement like that as, look what God is doing, and we might just run with it. He was so concerned to make sure that he was in the will of God that he almost threw obstacles in God's way. Like he was so wanting to make sure that this was of God that even though now he was being sent to my house, he didn't 100% just take that as God was going to have us get married. He was just sort of watching to see what God would do and just bringing every detail to the Lord. So he came back, and here we are. You know, the camp season is over. I'm preparing to come back to school at EI at the Institute. And Dan began to make the rounds of doctor's appointments with Resham and his son that my dad helped to set up, and my mom would go with them, and I would stay home and do some cooking or do whatever I needed to do at home. But he ended up staying those whole 2 weeks before school was beginning to start because they still hadn't figured out what was going on with Resham's son. Meanwhile, things were happening between us. Interesting. Nothing was spoken between us at all, but I began to realize that I really cared for this man. I describe it like when you go to a stage play and you're sitting in the audience before it begins, the curtain is drawn, but you know that behind that curtain, all the pieces are in place to start the story, right? It's like that's what God did in my heart. God had put all the pieces in place in my heart to love this man, but I didn't see it because he kept the curtain down until that period of 2 weeks. When he was at my house and school was about to start, all of a sudden it was like the Lord drew back the curtain and I realized something. I love this man. And that's when I got kind of scared because I'm like, I do not want to be one more in a long string of girls who are falling in love with Mr. Johnson. That's what I said I would not do. So I was really crying out to the Lord to take this away. Please take this away. Meanwhile, my mom she knew what the conversation had been back in July. She was all for this, but of course she didn't bring it back up with Dan. In fact, she was kind of clueless how this came across. But when Dan did arrive for that 2-week thing, we had several other house guests with us. And one of them was a married couple. And my mom, when Dan arrived at the door, she was trying to explain to him who was at the house because it was that married couple plus a couple other people. She's like, you're going to have to stay in the basement because the guest rooms are taken up by this person. And she said, and there's this married couple that's staying with us. They're having a little bit of conflict and issues in their marriage. We're trying to help them. He's 23 years older than she is. And that was true. But Dan took that as one more shot at him. He thought what she meant was, okay, this couple's having trouble because he's so much older than she is. She didn't mean it that way at all. She will tell you, or would have told you, that all she was doing was trying to describe, who was here. But he took it as like, well, Lord, I just have to leave this in your hands. I don't know what you're doing. that feels discouraging. But anyway, he just, camped his stuff down in the basement where, laid out there was a mattress on the basement floor, and he had the basement to himself. But during those 2 weeks, he began to realize that maybe my mom wasn't so negative after all, because she would sit us together at the table or ask us to do the dishes together. Like, she was throwing us together in her own sweet, not so subtle way. And he began to notice this too. And at one point, my baby brother's 4 years younger than me, but he's been taller than me since he was 9 years old. But he, brothers can be sometimes. At one point, we were all like hanging around in the living room after dinner, and my brother turned to Dan and said, "My sister has a crush on you." Oh. And at this point, I couldn't deny it, but I was so embarrassed. And Dan told me later, he took it as encouragement, and he was happy to hear it. But of course, oh my goodness, how do you walk through a moment like that when your little brother tells your teacher you got a crush on him? Oh, I could have died and sunk through the floor. But anyway, we made it through. But as the days progressed, even though encouragements were happening, Dan had told the Lord, if you really are doing this, you're going to have to do something so unusual that I know it's you, God. Like, you're going to have to arrange something to happen that to me is like a sign that's unusual. So he and my mom and Reshem's son were in a waiting room waiting for a doctor's appointment, when my mom turned to Reshem and said, "What do you think the Lord has for Amy after she goes to the third year at Institute? She doesn't know what she's going to do after school." Now, as a backstory here, Reshem had come and arrived in the States, and after a few days of observing my household, me, Dan, everything going on, the Lord had put it on his heart that Dan should marry me, but he didn't know what to do with that information. He was just praying about it. And so when my mom asked him this question in the waiting room, in Dan's presence, although Dan was playing with the little boy at the time, Reshem took his opportunity, and he turned to my mother and he said, "Well, she should marry someone in the Lord's work, and he should be at least 15 years older than she is." And at that point, Dan was, his ears perked up, and he was like, the next thing he's going to say is his name should be Dan Johnson. But that was such an unusual thing for someone to say that he took that as an answer to the prayer that he had prayed, that God would do something so unusual. Well, he took that encouragement, but still, as the days went on, they were going to medical appointments, trying to figure things out. That it came time to where it was really close to time for school to begin. And Dan needed to get back to South Carolina. I needed to get back to South Carolina. Nothing had been determined yet about this little boy with the medical need. So Dan took a day of prayer and fasting. I think it was on a Sunday. And he was praying over the situation with the little boy with the medical need, but he was also bringing all of this to the Lord. He's like, "Lord, look at all you've done. You sent me here. You answered the prayer for something unusual, but I still really need assurance. What are you doing?" And then all of a sudden, sweetly out of the blue, the words of a Bible verse streamed into his mind. It's one of the ways that the Lord can speak. "Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it." And when he heard that voice in his head, he knew it was the Lord, and he took it as the Lord's encouragement that this is what he wanted to do. Because it was like, "Dan, you've tried to put a lot of water on this. You've tried to put out this fire, and you can't because it's from me. I'm actually doing this. It's a gift I'm going to give you." So at that point, there was one more thing that needed to happen for him to really feel free to walk forward, and that is he needed to talk to my dad. He had never, at this point, talked to me at all about his feelings, his prayers, anything. I knew nothing of this story. I was completely blind. I was upstairs going, "Lord, take these feelings away, because I don't want to be just another girl who's in love with Dan Johnson." But the night before, we needed to get to South Carolina, and that's what ended up being determined. Was he had to get to South Carolina. I had to get to South Carolina. My parents were tied up helping Reshem. The obvious course of action was that Dan needed to drive me to South Carolina. We needed to drive down there together. And then my parents would come later with my more stuff from my dorm room, whatever, my rocking chair and all that. But we needed to get down there. So the night before we were to leave, my dad, Dan asked to have a conversation with my dad. And I knew he had asked to speak with him, and I assumed it had something to do with Reshem. I found my heart wondering if it had something to do with me, but I almost didn't dare let myself hope that. What ended up happening was Dan had said to the Lord, I'm going to talk to her dad. If he gives me a standard Christian neutral answer or a negative answer, I will not follow through with this. He has to give me a positive answer or I won't do anything about it. So he began to talk to my dad about his interest in me and the course of action, the different things that had happened, how God had answered prayers, and here we were. And he tried to paint a picture that would be easy for my dad to say no if he wanted to. You know, he's like, I know I'm 17 and a half years older than she is, and you know, I've got more gray hair than my brother, and it's all this sort of thing. And so my dad, in his answer to Dan, he started out by saying, you know, I can't tell you what the will of God is. It is a matter of what's the will of God. And if he had stopped there, Dan would not have moved forward. That was too neutral. But then my dad said, but I can tell you this. If it is the will of God, it will make her mother and I very happy. And that was the last thing Dan needed to hear. And at that point, he knew that this is what he was going to pursue. Now, he didn't know when he would talk to me about it, but we did have a, 10 to 12 hour trip coming up the next day. And so we left at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I got to say, it was all of 3 o'clock in the afternoon before he said anything. Like all that time we're driving down, and I had brought needlework to do because I didn't want to bring a book because I didn't want to be doing something that wasn't, friendly. So I had handwork to do, but I could pay attention. Well, it was just generic conversation, and we stopped at lunchtime and had a picnic at the Natural Bridge in Virginia. And all this time I'm getting a little bit more and more, not uncomfortable in a negative way, but just like wondering, who is this now? Like, who is this? Is this just Mr. Johnson? Is this something more? I have no clue what's going on. And when we had our picnic, we took a walk to see the Natural Bridge. And as we walked back down the trail, it started to rain, and he pulled out his umbrella, and we were walking under the same umbrella. And I mean, this is just so unusual for Mr. Johnson to be spending time with a girl like this. You just didn't see that. And I didn't know what to think. And he turned to me and he said, "What are you thinking about?" And I remember thinking, I can't tell you what I'm thinking about. There's no way I can tell you. So I really quick arranged my mind and my thoughts and said, I'm thinking about what it must have been like when the first people who discovered this trail found the Natural Bridge. That was like totally a lie, except I made myself think it so that I wouldn't have to tell them what I was really thinking, which is, I have no idea who you are to me right now. But anyway, we went on our way. And again, it was like 3 p.m. before he turned off the music. And he said, Amy, let's pray. And then we need to talk about something. As soon as he said that, I had a clue that something big was coming. And oh my goodness. You know how you get an adrenaline rush? Like it's just like you just, get hot and cold all over. But he began to pray. And then he began to tell me this story that went back for years. I had not had a clue. Everything I just poured out to you, the only piece of it that I knew was my perspective. I had no clue of all these things that had happened. Not the conversations with my mother or anything. But as he was unfolding this story to me, it was like he was speaking in one ear, and in the other ear, the Lord was saying to me, this is what I've been preparing you for all your life. And I knew in that moment, any concept I had in my mind of what Mr. Prince Charming would look like or anything just disappeared. I knew that it was Dan Johnson, and that's who God had made me for. And so when he finished pouring out this story, and he didn't ask me to marry him at that point, but he said, I'm not afraid of marriage in spite of what people think, that kind of thing. So I knew that he was thinking this wasn't just, oh, let's start a relationship. He's thinking towards marriage, which makes sense. He was 38 years old. But what the Lord gave me to say to him when he was done and wanted to know what I was thinking was, my life is not my own to give. But if the Lord should choose to entrust it to you, then I am more than happy. And at that moment then, once that was established, there was a sense of the presence of God in that car. It was like the Lord Jesus was sitting there between us. It was absolutely precious. It was, of course, a whole new revelation to me. Like all of a sudden, I went from going back to school to having an idea of what the rest of my life was supposed to look like. And it's stunning. It's really stunning. And then, you get back to school and you can't say anything to anybody at all because he hadn't told Mr. Carroll. He hadn't told Art Nurnberg. He hadn't told his mother. He hadn't mentioned this to anybody. And you can't start a fresh school year with this kind of splashy news that the Bachelor to the Rapture teacher on campus is suddenly in a relationship. So we had to say nothing to anybody. But it became a really sweet process, though, because as the weeks went on, he finally had a chance to talk to Mr. Carroll. Mr. Carroll was like, well, wait, be kind of quiet about it. Pray about it for 3 months. I didn't really need to pray about it for a whole 3 months because the Lord had already spoken to me. But that was fine. It was fine to be patient. It gave us a chance to spend some time together, knowing we were going to get married, because most people, they get to know each other and then they date, but we got to know each other as teacher and student, and we had never spent time together with an intention toward relationship. So once we had this established that this is where we were headed, then there were some opportunities where we could meet off campus. He'd leave at some time and I'd leave later, and we'd meet at the parking lot at Furman University and go from there, spend some time together. But it was a good school year of that sort of process. And little by little, people began to find out. And one of the cool things to us was that as people did begin to find out, it eventually became the secret that most everybody knew, but it was still kind of meant to be hush-hush until a number of months later. But when people did find out, the response of everybody was positive. Mm-hmm. Even my grandparents, which, we wondered what they would think. And just different people even some would say, we were praying that you would get married to Dan. Or there was somebody that said to him, we always felt like you and Amy were meant for each other. And he didn't have a clue anybody would have put that 2 and 2 together. Here's a really cool little piece of the story, too. After Dan and I had that trip to South Carolina and we knew that the Lord was putting us together, very quickly, the medical need of Resham's son resolved. And it was a very simple answer. And where, all that time they couldn't figure out what was wrong with him and how to fix it, the Lord brought Resham and his son across the ocean, almost like it was just so that Resham could tell Dan what he needed to tell him. And then the medical need was fixed and Resham's son was fine. And he just kept being fine. So it's a really cool thing. So we went through that school year. We were married in June after the school year ended. And it's a very sweet thing to have an assurance in your heart that God has done something, that God has put your story together. And, as I've said before, we were married for 31 and a half years before the Lord took Dan home. And that whole 31 and a half years, it's an adventure and it was beautiful. There is no marriage that will ever be perfect, but it can be wonderful and beautiful and an earthly picture of the love of Christ for his bride. And that's what it was. And I'm very, very grateful for that piece of my story. When the Lord took Dan home to heaven, it was like a book ended. And a new book began. And that's a hard thing to walk through. But I can say even now from this perspective now, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He's still wonderful. He does wonderful things. He is the same on the wonderful day as he is on the hardest day of your life. He's always the same. And he really does take care of what we put in his hands. We put our lives in his hands. I put my life in the Lord's hands. So did Dan. And when you do that, he takes care of it. He may turn it in a direction you didn't expect. He may teach you difficult lessons through it, but he takes care of it. And it is a wonderful thing to trust him to put your life story together and make it what he wants it to be. So that's my story.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that story. It's so sweet to be able to hear just all the ways the Lord worked in your life and in his life to bring you together. And I'm just so thankful that we get to share this with everyone now, and hope it blesses everyone who listens to it. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to reach out to us, you can find us on Instagram at riversfromthealtar or by email at riversfromthealtar@gmail.com.
Have a wonderful day and see you next time.